I guess, Arthur, whenever you're ready, should we wait one more minute or, oh, there's another person. You know, let's give it till 9:01 because people are really just coming on. Okay. Hi, Peggy. Okay, it's 9:01. Um, Greetings, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good week. Um, this is our, I'm sad to say it, it's the fourth class with Arthur. And it's our last one with him leading us. Um, I really just enjoyed this so much, Arthur. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's take it away.
So good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. The first of the four sessions that we had together had to do with a basic introduction to the book. Then we looked at two chapters, and I hope that those two chapters were chapters that were understandable. They're not typical chapters because a number of the chapters are highly technical and somewhat complex. But as I mentioned before, my contention is that if you go round and round the book a few times, you pick things up here and there, and the second time you go through something, it will the going through it all will inform questions that you had going through it first time. This last class together, what I want to do is not go through a whole chapter, but rather share with you some of what I think are the best of sections of the book. Some will be just one sentence. Some will take a look at the book and read a whole page. But these are things that I in particular relate to and find important. So the first thing I wanted to say is that the edition of the 13 Petal Rose that you probably have, there were 3 editions published, and only the first one has a subtitle to the book. The title, of course, is The 13 Petaled Rose, but the original subtitle was A Discourse on the Essence of Jewish Existence and Belief. So what we're talking about here are not history and not customs and not holidays and those kinds of things, but rather the abstract ideas that hold up Judaism, that are underneath and hold up the whole edifice. So one of the things that we talked about, that one of the chapters that we did was the way of choice. And in the way of choice, the theme of the way of choice is the notion that's very different from some of our non-Jewish neighbors' notions, that rather than there be a hierarchy of emotions and a hierarchy of values, rather in Judaism, we put all of the potentialities of the heart, as the rabbi puts it, on the same level, and they're good or bad, not in and of themselves, but how they're used. So I don't know if, after 3 sessions, sometimes I forget what I said in the first or second or third session. So forgive me if you've heard this before. But the subject that I think of when I think of the way of choice is a conversation that I had with Rabbi Steinsaltz, about 40 years ago, a little shy of 40 years ago. And one of the questions that I asked him during that conversation was, what do you think of marijuana? What do you think of marijuana? I don't think did I mention this before? Okay, well, so I asked him, what do you think of marijuana? So again, this was almost 40 years ago. So things have changed over the decades in terms of our attitudes and legality of marijuana. But think of it 40 years ago. I asked him, what does he think of marijuana? And the rabbi said, first of all, he said, I never tried it, so I can't speak from personal experience. But the question is not, he said, whether marijuana is good or bad. The question is, who is the master and who is the slave? If you're the slave to anything, the rabbi said to me, it's a problem. If you're the master of something, well, that's a whole different story. The example that he gave me from his life is smoking a pipe. He told me that he smokes a pipe usually every day, except for Shabbos, for years and years and years. But on Pesach, he stops. He doesn't smoke a pipe on Pesach, not for a religious reason necessarily, but because he wants to find out whether he's a slave. And after the week, he can determine that no, I'm not a slave to it. I can easily stop, but he doesn't stop because he likes it. So I think it was a good example of the way of choice. The rabbi said to me, it's not only about marijuana; it's about anything in life. About anything, it can be Torah study. If you're a slave to Torah study, well, you might want to question that relationship. So it was kind of a shocking thing for him to say that Torah study, but I understand what he meant by that. That if you're a slave to Torah study, then you have to get out every once in a while. So it's a balance, and for each of us it's different. One of the themes that runs through the book, particularly in two chapters, is the idea of infinity. And the rabbi speaks a lot about infinity. I teach a class on Monday nights, and one of I've been doing it for years, and one of the students in the class said to me, could you ask Rabbi Steinsaltz a question for me? She's a teacher of young children. And she said, I'd like to know what the curriculum should be. What should I teach these young children? And he said to me, tell her to have the children contemplate infinity. That they're not going to have such a problem with it, the way some of us have problems with it. Contemplate infinity. I was with the rabbi once a bunch of years later. In Manhattan, he was staying at somebody's apartment in Manhattan, and I was living in Brooklyn at the time. And it was Friday afternoon, and Shabbos was coming. But I was talking to the rabbi, asking him questions and questions. At a certain point, Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, Arthur, it's getting close to Shabbos. You better get out of here. And I said, okay, I will. I'll have enough time to get home. But I want to ask you just one more question, if I could. Just one small question. I said to the rabbi, how do you raise children? Nice small question. Specifically, I asked him, how do you raise children spiritually? How do you raise children religiously? And he said to me, there are two things to keep in mind. He said, one is teach your children the most abstract theological notions you can teach them. Don't dumb it down. Don't dumb it down. Teach your children, as Bob Dylan once sang in one of his songs, I don't want to learn what I got to unlearn. So this is the one thing that the rabbis said to me, that teach your children the most abstract theological notions that you can. The second thing that he told me was, don't just teach your children what they can understand. Just because they can't understand it doesn't mean you shouldn't teach it. The example he gave from his life was, he told me that his grandmother, when he was a boy, his grandmother taught him how to say Modeh Ani, the one sentence we say as soon as we wake up in the morning to thank God for the new day. He said, when my grandmother taught me that sentence, Modeh Ani lefanecha, and so on, I didn't know what she was even talking about. But I'm glad that I had it within me, because when I finally realized what it was about, I already had it. So don't teach your children, teach your children the most abstract theological notions you can, and don't dumb it down, and don't just teach them what they can understand. If they can't understand it, still having them know it, or know it on a certain, whatever level, it'll catch up to them after a while, and they'll be glad that they were taught it. Rabbi Steinsaltz once was one of his fields is mathematics. And he said to me once that he said, what is faith? He said, it's like the geometry theorem called Desargues' theorem. Now, Desargues' theorem is not a theorem in plane geometry that we learned in high school. It's a part of geometry that has to do with cones and has to do with the movement of cones. And within that field, there's this notion of Desargues' theorem. Now, if you look up in a dictionary or a good dictionary or encyclopedia, you'll see that you can understand Desargues' theorem quite easily. If you can understand what the words are talking about, it's not such a difficult theorem. The problem with Desargues' theorem, the rabbi said to me, was that you can't prove it. As simple as it is, as simple as you're looking at it and understanding what it says, there's no way to prove it until you imagine a point in the infinite. And when you imagine a point in the infinite, then you can prove Desargues' theorem. He said, that's what faith is, he said to me. He said, it's bringing the infinite into your equation. It's without the infinite, all kinds of dilemmas and all kinds of problems. You bring the infinite into the equation and things change radically. So Desargues' theorem was a good analogy for me and was parallel to his recommendation that you teach children about infinity. Now, I was debating with myself whether or not to say this at the beginning or the end, but let me do it at the beginning. I'm going to read a paragraph to you from the second chapter. You don't have to look at it right now. I'll just read it to you. It's about infinity. The rabbi says, precisely because the divine is apprehended as an infinite, not a finite force, everything in the cosmos, whether large or small, is only a small part of the pattern, so that there is no difference in weight or gravity between any one part and another. The number one and the number a million is the same in relationship to infinity. But he goes on to say, the movement of a man's finger is as important or unimportant as the most terrible catastrophe. For as against the infinite, both are of the same dimension. Just as the infinite can be defined as an unlimited in the sense of being beyond everything, so God can be defined as being close to and touching everything. So that's a pretty fierce teaching, that the movement of a man's finger is as important or unimportant as the most terrible catastrophe when measured up against the infinite. So it's a real fierce teaching, I think, but one that I felt was worth mentioning. Another idea that the rabbi teaches in the book that intrigues me quite a bit was in the chapter called Tshuva, a chapter called Repentance, I should say. The rabbi talks about despair being an essential part of Tshuva. Despair is essential to the process of Tshuva. In other words, if you feel despair, well, don't despair. Because despair is an essential part of the process of Tshuva. Despair is an essential part of Tshuva, and it's the tension that's built up in those times of despair that allow you to overleap your past. That tension of the despair is essential to the process of Tshuva. So I wanted to mention that. Now, there are, as I mentioned last week, there are 3 chapters in the book that have to do with the 10 Sfirot. Chapter 2, chapter 3, and one of the additional chapters. So while I'm sure that Rabbi Shmuley is going to talk about that in his 10-week class starting next week, in an in-depth look at this book, The 13 Petalled Rose, you might as well start learning what they mean before you get there. I remember the first time I encountered the 10 Sfirot in the book, the first thing I said to myself is, I'm never going to remember all this. Well, of course, after a while, I was able to remember them. But the other thing that I thought about the 10 Sfirot is that I lost my train of thought, but I'll come back to it. Excuse me for a second. Let me read another passage to you that I find to be quite relevant to my life, at least. The process of the soul's connection with the body, called the descent of the soul into matter, is, from a certain perspective, the soul's profound tragedy. But the soul undertakes this terrible risk as a part of the need to descend in order to make the desired ascent to hitherto unknown heights. It is a risk and a danger because of the soul's connection with the body and its contact with the material world, where it is the only factor that is free, unbounded by the determinism of physical law, and able to choose and move freely, make it possible for the soul to fall, and in falling, to destroy the world. Indeed, creation itself and the creation of man is precisely such a risk, a descent for the sake of ascension. Every descent is for the sake of ascension. We know that from an amusement park. If you go on a roller coaster, you want to get up that high part of the roller coaster. Well, first you come down, go low, and pick up some speed, and that enables you to go higher once you get through that low. In our tradition, there's no such thing as down. Every down is for the sake of the up. Every descent is for the sake of ascension. So I find it to be an intriguing notion and a comforting notion, because when one is feeling that despair, when you know, it's what Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said. What did Rabbi Nachman say was the worst sin? He said the worst sin is depression. Not depression like clinical depression, but depression that you feel that you've sunk so low that there's nowhere to go. But as we just said, every descent is for the sake of ascension. So if you're going down for one reason or another, you're not going down. You're just preparing yourself for the ascent that will come by virtue of the descent, a descent for the sake of ascension. I wanted to mention something that that's a little bit off the subject, but it's about Rabbi Steinsaltz, and it's about Teaneck, New Jersey. So it happens that years ago, there was one evening that I had to take Rabbi Steinsaltz to Teaneck. He was giving a lecture that night at I don't remember the name of the synagogue, but it was a modern Orthodox synagogue. And the place was mobbed. You couldn't get into the place. The people were out the window and out the door, coming to have an opportunity to listen to the great Rabbi Steinsaltz. So Rabbi Steinsaltz gets on the stage after a kind of generous introduction, and he says to the people, "I'm very uncomfortable here." And suddenly you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was there enthusiastically to hear the rabbi. And the first thing he does is he says to the group, "I'm very uncomfortable here."
Wow.
He then said, "I'm very uncomfortable where you've put me." He said, "I don't know why you put me here with my back to the Aron Kodesh."
Wow.
He said, "You shouldn't put me in that position." And again, the place was, you could hear a pin drop. The place was silent and kind of shocked by the rabbi. He said, "But there is one way that we can proceed. And that is if you make me a Torah. If you make me a Torah, make me into a Torah, then I can stand where I'm standing now." And I thought it was a very beautiful thing that he said. I remember when I used to hang out in Brooklyn in Bobov on Simchas Torah, all the little shuls in the area bring their Sefer Torahs to the Bobov Beis Midrash. And there's a long table, and each of the people who's carrying the Torah to the synagogue, Bobov puts it down, and then after the table is filled, they put the Torah on, the next Torahs on top of the Torahs that were just put down. And then they put the Torahs on top of those Torahs. and on top of those Torahs. And it's a very surreal vision of this whole mountain of Torahs, because the only thing that you can put on top of a Torah is another Torah. So the rabbi was saying, if you make me into a Torah, I can stand here. As a little bit of an aside, I want to mention one more thing about Bobov. So I live pretty close to the Bobover community there in Borough Park. And so I went there. And I had a friend who encouraged me to go. And one day my friend said to me, you ought to speak to the Rebbe. You should ask him some questions. And I said to him, well, that's nice. How do you do it? And he said, well, you get online. Did I mention this story? I don't think I did. You get online. And after Marav in the evening, the Rebbe comes out and he goes into his office. And then one by one, people go into the office to speak to him. I'm usually early, so I got there before the Rebbe got there, and I was first online. And then the line starts to build up. And then one guy comes in with wearing a suit and an attaché case, and he says to me, I have to make a flight at LaGuardia Airport. Can I get in front of you? And so the guy got in front of him. Then a few minutes later, a little boy, about 10 years old, is paying us for flapping, and he said, he had tears in his eyes, and he said to me, I need to speak to the Rebbe. Can I get in front of you? And so now I'm third online. And that's kind of how the evening went. But sooner or later, I went in to speak to the Bobover Rebbe. Now, my friend who encouraged me to go, said to me, you shouldn't go in just to schmooze. You should have something on your mind to talk about. So I was standing there, and before you go in to see the Rebbe in this Hasidic group in Bobov, you have somebody write a kvittel for you. A kvittel is like the little pieces of paper that people stick into the Western Wall. Those are kvitlach. At the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you see a whole pool of kvitlach there of people who are writing a letter to the Rebbe. So my friend said to me, you should have some things in mind. So I had 3 questions that I wanted to talk about with the Rebbe. I didn't tell anybody these questions. I didn't tell my friend, I didn't tell anybody these questions. But I had the kvittel, and the kvittel had my 2 daughters on it. My son had not been born yet. And I walk into his office, and I was told that what you do is you take the kvittel and you hand it to him. So I walked up to his desk. I was standing and he was sitting. And I walked up to him and I gave him the kvittel. And he grabbed the kvittel and he took my hand as well. And he didn't let go of my hand. My first question to him was going to be, why am I here? Why am I in your office? Why is a guy who grew up in an assimilated family on Long Island doing it in the office of a Hasidic rabbi? Why am I here? And I didn't get a word out of my mouth. And the Rebbe said to me, so, you're wondering why you're here? You're wondering why you're in my office and not somebody else's office? He then lets go of my hand, and he starts pounding on the table, and he says, I want to tell you something very important. There's no such thing as a coincidence. He had the big Mikra Gedola on the table, and he opens up to the place where Abraham sends his servant, Eliezer, to find a wife for Isaac. And the Rebbe pointed to me in the margin a comment where it says there, they plan to meet by chance. So the Rebbe looked at me and said, what do you mean they plan to meet by chance? Either they plan to meet or it's by chance. He said, no, they plan to meet by chance. He said to me, I think that it's a coincidence, but there's no such thing as a coincidence. The second thing that I wanted to ask him was, what do I do with my averas? What do I do with my sins? I have a collection of sins, and it seems to get bigger all the time. What do I do with these sins? What do I do with this nice collection I have? I didn't get a word out of my mouth still, and he said to me, and stop worrying about your sins. Just what I was thinking. Stop worrying about your sins, he said. He said, don't worry about your past, and don't worry about your future. just worry about your mitzvahs in the present. Your mitzvahs in the present are going to take care of your past, and they're going to take care of your future. Just worry about your mitzvahs in the present. The third question of the three that I wanted to ask him was, and I had not told anybody these questions. I wanted to ask him, I just had in my mind, oh, could you give me some advice? I asked him, could you give me some advice? I figured that maybe it's time for me to put on 2 pair of tefillin, not 1 pair of tefillin. Or maybe something else that I wasn't doing that the Rebbe, because I figured if the Rebbe of a Rebbe were to tell me what to do, give me some advice, then it would push me a little bit to do it. So I didn't say anything to him. He said, and all of a sudden he says to me, and I'd like to give you some advice. Just what I was thinking. He said, I'd like to give you some advice. And he proceeded to give me some advice. Now, I can't reveal to you what the question was, because the fact of the matter is I have not yet taken his advice. But when I do take his advice, if ever, maybe I can come back and I'll tell you what that advice was. But 1, 2, 3, he was like reading my mind. The next night in the Beis Midrash, I saw the Rebbe's son, his oldest son, who became the Baba of a Rebbe when his father died. And I said to the son, I said, last night I was in your father's office and he read my mind. And the son shrugged his shoulders and said, so what else is new? I've been seeing this all my life. There are some people who have some special powers. And if you go to The Strife of the Spirit by Rabbi Steinsaltz, there's a whole chapter about these special powers that some people have. And again, the question the Rabbi says is not whether or not these special powers are real. They are real. Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, the question is really, what are you going to do with those powers? What are you going to do with them? That's the question. Again, the way of choice. Last week we encountered the notion of the sin of knowing. The sin of knowing. Now, I always thought that Jews we were the knowledge people. We would send our kids to college and all that stuff. What do you mean the sin of knowing? So the sin of knowing is when you learn so much that you really don't, and stuff that you don't care about, that your mind is filled with all kinds of things that don't really speak to you, and rather than clarify reality, they obfuscate reality. And as I mentioned the other week, I apologize to my children. I used to apologize to my children all the time for sending them to school. I knew that when I went to school, I hated it. And there I was sending my children to the same places that I hated. Because I think in so many of the schools, they give you heaps and heaps, as the rabbi says, heaps and heaps of unrelated facts, which might be interesting and might even be important, but don't really speak to your soul. Don't really speak to your soul. So that's the sin of knowing. Another idea that we looked at last week was the idea that when you say to yourself, where am I? Where am I? What am I doing? Rabbi Sandel suggests that when you say that question to yourself, where am I? It's not really your voice. That if you quiet down enough, you can hear that it's God's voice asking you what you're now asking yourself. Every time I say to myself, what am I doing? Where am I going? Who am I? It's not me who's asking those questions. I'm asking the echo of the questions that Hashem is asking me. I wanted to read another passage from the book. The rabbi, this is in a chapter called The Soul of Man, chapter 3. And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, thus consciousness, assuming ever new identification along the lifeline of the soul, thus consciousness is the way of man's ascent to perfection. Now again, I don't know about you folks, but I never encountered in any of the introduction to Judaism books that I read in 296 in the Dewey Decimal System in the public library, nobody ever spoke about consciousness. And yet one of the threads that run through this book that I can I have it here, but I won't waste the time now. Sentence after sentence, passage after passage, that this pursuit that we're doing is raising our consciousness, raising our consciousness. Another passage that I wanted to read. I was thinking earlier this evening that Rabbi Steindels once said to me that there's a special place in hell for people who think to be Jewish is to follow the Shulchan Aruch. I almost fell off my chair. I said, what did you say? He said, there's a special place in hell for people who feel that to be Jewish is to follow the Shulchan Aruch. So with that in mind, I want to read a little passage here. The rabbi writes, the Jewish way of life, or the way of life of the Jew who lives according to the Torah, is held to be extremely difficult. According to tradition, there are said to be 613 commandments in the Torah. This, however, is misleading in a number of respects. For one thing, many of the positive commandments, that is, mitzvot that obligate one to perform certain actions, along with many of the prohibitions, are not actually concerned with life, but refer either to the general structure of the whole of the Torah or to the Jewish nation as a body. No Jew, therefore, can be expected to keep all of the mitzvot. Actually, only a small number of mitzvot relate to daily life. Although, if one adds to the formal list of mitzvot all the minute details that are not specifically included, one arrives at the sum of not hundreds, but of thousands of things that are to be done at certain times and in certain places in a special way. Indeed, seen as separate and unrelated commandments, each as an individual obligation and burden, these ancillary mitzvot seem to be a vast and even absurd assortment of petty details, which are, if not downright intimidating, then at least troublesome. What we call details, the rabbi says, however, are not parts, are only parts of greater units, which in turn combine in various ways into a single entity. It is as though in examining the leaves and flowers of a tree, one were to be overwhelmed by the abundance, the variety, and the complexity of detail. But when one realizes that it is all part of the same single growth, all part of the same branching out into manifold forms of the one tree, then the details would cease to be disturbing and would be accepted as intrinsic to the wondrousness of the whole. A basic idea underlying Jewish life is that there are no special frameworks for holiness. A man's relation to God is not set apart on a higher plane, not relegated to some special corner of time and place with all the rest of life taking place somewhere else. The Jewish attitude is that life in all its aspects, in its totality, must somehow or other be bound up with holiness. This attitude is expressed in part through conscious action, that is, through the utterance of prescribed prayers and blessings, and following prescribed forms of conduct, and in part by adhering to a number of prohibitions. Man generally passes through the world aware that it is full of possible colors and meaning, and he tries to make his own connection with all its many possibilities. What he may be less aware of is the fact that there are worlds upon worlds besides the one he knows, dependent on his actions. In Judaism, man is conceived in all the power of body and soul as the central agent, the chief actor on a cosmic stage. He functions or performs as a prime mover of worlds being made in the image of the Creator. Everything he does constitutes an act of creation, both in his life, his own life, and other worlds hidden from his sight. Every single particle of his body, every nuance of his thought and feeling are connected with forces of all kinds in the cosmos, forces without number. So that the more conscious he is of this order of things, the more significantly does he function as a Jewish person. One more paragraph. The system of mitzvot constitute the design for a coherent harmony. Its separate components being like the instruments of an orchestra. So vast is the harmony to be created by the orchestra that it includes the whole world and promises the perfecting of the world. Seeing the mitzvot in this light, one may understand on the one hand the need for so great a number of details, and on the other the denial of any exclusive emphasis on any one detail or aspect of life. The mitzvot as a system include all of life, from the time one opens one's eyes in the morning until one goes to sleep, from the day of birth to the last breath. He then proceeds in the chapter to talk about, he says, for practical purposes, the system of mitzvot may be divided into several main fields: prayers and blessing, modes of conduct on special days of the week, dietary regulations, such as permitted and forbidden food, sexual behavior, relation to one's fellow man. So what we do in so many of these books is we take the mitzvot and we like a mailman putting letters into a certain box. Okay, this is a sexual one, and this is one having to do with behavior, and this one has to do with what you do on certain holidays, and it's gives the impression that the mitzvot are split into various subjects, when in fact, as the rabbi says, that's not the way to look at it. The mitzvot are pervasive in everything that we do. I remember there was a time when I felt instead of there being too many mitzvot, there weren't enough. That I wanted to find every opportunity that I could to somehow make an effort to connect with God. The rabbi uses a phrase in the book where he says that you have to shatter the order of your existence. He recommends that you shatter the order of your existence. Now, what does that mean? How do I shatter the order of my existence? Well, just to give a small example, we know that in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, it's the four famous definitions by Ben Zoma, who was wise and who was strong and who was honored and who was rich. The definition of who is rich is the person who is satisfied with what he has. I would contend that if you ignore everything that Judaism tells us to not ignore and just incorporate into your life that one thing, which is the definition of who is rich, the order of your existence is shattered. The way you look at your own life is shattered. The way you judge other people and evaluate things is shattered. That's what it is to shatter the order of your existence. Another passage that I really like is the rabbi says one's relationship with God is a completely private affair. It's a completely private affair. Nobody can butt into you and get into what your relationship to God is. It's your relationship to God, and it's a completely private affair. I want to say that there are several phrases in the book that really say the same thing. Jewish thought pays little attention to inner tranquility and peace of mind. As we mentioned earlier, a few weeks ago, there's a chapter in the book, The Strife of the Spirit. It's called it's the title essay. It's called The Strife of the Spirit, and the rabbi says that Jewish thought pays little attention to inner tranquility and peace of mind. Instead, the rabbi says in the book somewhere else, it's a constant process of going toward. He says, if you think you've arrived, you're lost. It's a continuous going to God, day after day, year after year. In the chapter called Mitzvot, the rabbi says, offenses like insults, slander, and gossip are in many ways considered far more severe misdeeds than specific religious or ritual transgressions. I think that was a little startling to me, but how true. Offenses like insults, slander, and gossip are in many ways considered far more severe misdeeds than specific religious or ritual transgressions. In the 13 Petalled Rose, Rabbi Seinfeld defines Judaism as not as a religion and not as a nation, but rather as a family, that the Jewish people are a family. I would urge you to track down another book by Rabbi Seinfeld, which most people who I speak to never heard of. But it's as the others are, a very profound book. It's called We Jews. And it's like an open letter to the Jewish people on the subject of who are we? Who are we? There's one chapter about why do people hate us so much? There's a chapter on Jews and money. What is it with Jews and money? And there's chapter after chapter and chapter of things that we've heard about, things that we've felt, things that we encounter, and yet We are a single large family. I want to also mention that the chapter 10 in the 30 Petal Rose is not a chapter like any other in the book. It's called an additional note on the Kiddush ritual. It explains in detail just a few minutes on Friday night when you make Kiddush. And you see by Rabbi Seinfeld's description that the Kiddush ritual is a Kabbalistic ritual. It's embedded within, Kabbalah is embedded within that ritual. The way you hold the cup, the numerical value of the words, the number of words in the Kiddush, other things as well. These are all things that some people say, well, Kabbalah is a fringe aspect of Judaism. It's most people don't care about it. We're not aware of the fact that so many of the things that we do as Jews are rooted in Kabbalistic teachings, and the rabbi just picks one sample, the sample of the Kiddush ritual, and shows how every detail of the Kiddush ritual comes from a Kabbalistic source. I'm going to read another passage to you. The rabbi says, the definition of the election of Israel as a nation of priests and a holy people make the Jews a people whose way of life constitutes the priesthood of the world, one whose intricate stylization of life, from the most personal act of the individual to the compound actions of its communities, its great centers of Jewish learning, its land, its holy temple, all constitute aspects of this function. The rabbi goes on to say, I do not mean to imply that holiness is in any way restricted to one people, or that the approach to the divine is not equally available to all mankind. It is only that Jews undertake a greater burden. With an acceptance of the Torah as an inner map, as an inner way of life, an inner map, they encumber themselves with the responsibility and obligation of a priesthood, not confined to a particular time or place, but for all of life. From this perspective, the whole world is a holy temple, and one that has to be constantly purified and sanctified anew. The priests who come together in the precincts of His holiness constitute the heartbeat of the world, the rhythm of mankind's breathing. The obligation is therefore greater and the responsibility heavier, precisely because of the feeling that this nation of priests, in its decline and disintegration, in the fall of its individuals, is not only destroying itself, but in some unseen way is impairing the way of the world as a whole, and that in its restoration and growth, it leads the world to its heart and its spiritual source, the Shekhinah. Now, I see that it's almost 45 minutes already, and I have so many more things I want to share, but let me just go to one last thing. In the chapter called Holiness, Rabbi Seinfeld says at the beginning of the chapter that there's no way to conceive of holiness, there's no way to define holiness. As he says, there's no way to define angels, and there's no way to explain all kinds of things. But holiness is connected to the world in three ways. One is through time, one is through space, and one is through the human being. In time, we have the days of the week, we have Shabbat, we have the month, we have the year, we have the 7 years. And so that's the way in which we measure and contact with holiness through time. We have the holiness of place. We have the holiness of place starting with the Holy of Holies, and the inner chambers and the outer chambers in the temple, and outside the temple, and rings of concentric circles that where the holiness of place is rooted. But then Rabbi Steinfeld says about the holiness of the person. And this reminds me of some of our relationships to Rabbi Steinsaltz over the years. The rabbi says, the life of a holy person becomes an example and a model for all men to follow. And a holy person may be a great king or a saintly tzaddik, a sage or a leader of his age, but he also may be one of the hidden saints whose holiness goes unrecognized by men. But in whatever manner the holiness shows itself, And no matter how intrinsic it may be to the personality of the man, it is still dependent on his connection with the divine plenty. An ordinary man, like me, who has been granted contact with the holy person, is thereby brought into a certain contact with true holiness. In this sense, the higher the level of a saintly person's holiness, the more he is like an angel, and in a way even more than an angel, acting as a vehicle of holiness by transmitting divine plenty from one world to another and bestowing such plenty upon whomever he chooses through his blessings, his actions, his prayers. The individual who makes inner contact with such a holy person, showing him love and devotion, thereby supports the flow of divine plenty in the world. This is what has been meant since in Jewish tradition from time immemorial, when devotion has been showed to those persons who are superior in holiness or who have an aura of sanctity. The gift is given such blessed men to create a bond of some sort that will draw them nearer, whether the holy person is connected to God by being a great scholar of the Torah, or whether he is just a saintly individual in his life. To honor, revere, and love the holy person is a mitzvah in itself, besides serving as a means for direct contact with holiness. And just as inner connection with holiness of place or time consecrates and raises one, so does the holy person. Although to be sure, the additional factor of conscious transfer of blessedness makes this contact the most heart-stirring and consequential of all human relationships. So it's our duty, our obligation to seek after holy people and to support them. By supporting them, you're supporting the flow of divine plenty in the world. And some of us have had the privilege with Rabbi Steinsaltz, who surely was one of those holy people in the world, that to support him, to connect with him, is to bring holiness into the world. Our 45 minutes is a little bit over. There's so much more to say, but I'm thrilled to know that we're going to have 10 more weeks with Rabbi Shmuley looking at this book. I'm sorry?
Or more.
Or more. We'll see how much. But we can go perhaps more systematically and more in depth with each of these things. So I hope that you appreciated some of the comments that I made and some of the quotes that I shared with you. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and for inviting me to do this. Thank you very much.
We're so grateful. We're so grateful. Thank you so much, Arthur. This was really a really powerful introduction to this book. And you really touched on, there was breath and there was depth. So,
so next week we're going to start. I just want to say, my wife and I discussed with encouragement from other people, it's going to be more of a joint learning session presented by myself and by my wife. I will take over the actual reading and explanation, but I'm sure my wife has a lot more to say, and she will help me out, including all of you. That's number one. Number two, just to get yourself positioned and situated and ready for next week, I am going to start from the first chapter. It's going to be a challenge, but I'll just give you an example. I just had recently a chavruta. I still have a learning one-on-one with a dear friend of mine, and we started Tractate Shabbat. And the beginning of Shabbat is not so easy. And so this particular person, this was a while ago, we've been learning for a while, he asked Rabbi Steinsaltz, his name is Mark Duransky, and he said, why did Chazal, why did the sages do this? And so Rabbi Steinsaltz, without missing a beat, answered, he said, they wanted to give you a zetz. They wanted to give you a little slap in the face type of thing, to wake you up and to see, are you ready type of thing. And that's what Rabbi Steinsaltz a little bit does at the beginning of the book. So get ready for a little zetz from Rabbi Steinsaltz. But I can say that a zetz from Rabbi Steinsaltz is somebody who's received some of them actually and verbally, and more than that. I've been a student of his since I was 14 years old. I'm now 46, almost 47. Getting a zetz from him is something very, very sweet, if you're able to take it the right way. So get ready next week for a Zets from Rabbi Steinsaltz.
And for very interactive learning, keep your finger on your mute buttons to unmute yourself. And we really want this to be, listen, the beauty of Zoom is that people can actually, it expands the potential and possibilities for learning, right? I mean, a lot of people wouldn't be able to leave their home at 9 in the evening on a weeknight. The other piece is that we want to make sure we're pulled in, like, as if we were all sitting around a large table and learning together. So
Yes. So we'll see you next week, and I hope you can all join. Tell your friends, tell your families. It's really important to learn this stuff. I do try to make it relevant as much as possible, even the esoteric, seemingly esoteric and abstract concepts. And we'll learn this together. We'll plow through. So we'll see you next week. And Arthur, thank you so much.
Arthur, so grateful. Anyone have anything to say for now?
Thank you very much, Arthur.
Thank
Enjoyed all your presentations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks, Nathan.
Really enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you.
Shirley, I have a question. Should we read ahead?
Sorry.
That's a very good question. You can try. You can try. It won't hurt.
Just don't let it scare you off.
Well, yeah. If it does, then you weren't ready. But
Even if you feel like, oh my gosh, what is this? Even better. Like if you want to read ahead and you want to try to get through that chapter, even the first few pages, because we're certainly not doing that whole
Right.
chapter in one class, not at all. Even if you want to read the first two pages to get yourself a little bit familiar with it, that would be great. But don't let it concern you if you're like, sometimes I read it and I really go slowly, sentence by sentence, and I get to the bottom of the paragraph and I'm like, yes, I really understood it. And then I get to the bottom of the second paragraph and I don't remember how to pull it together with the first. It's real work, but I have to tell you, it's the sweetest work. I really find it so deeply valuable. So yeah, read ahead, prepare yourself, but come back. Yes, Arthur?
Which edition are we going to use so we can be on the same page?
the new one.
Literally.
Oh, literally. We're using
I'm using the new one.
the one with the rose petals, but I think a lot of you have so Faggy has the old one.
Oh, that's the old one. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that is really
And then, but a bunch of you who bought from me have the new Corin version, the hardcover with the pattern. All right, so we'll have to figure that out. I'll put some thought to that this week. Everyone hold up what copy of the book they have. Do most people have? Okay, we've got, all right, so Kelly has the rose. All right, we'll see. All right, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
All
Very
right,
good. Thank
everyone,
you.
have a wonderful week.